My name is Elliot Reyes, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a public defender in Atlanta, spending my days in cramped courtrooms defending people who can't afford lawyers. Most would look at my modest apartment and secondhand suits and think I've failed at life. After today, I'm starting to think they might be right. I hadn't set foot on the Reyes estate in over 8 years, not since the Christmas dinner that ended with my father calling my career choice pathetic charity work. But death has a way of dragging you back to places you've sworn off forever. Richard Reyes, construction magnate, and my father had finally succumbed to the heart attack his doctors had been predicting for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The funeral was everything he would have wanted: opulent, crowded with Georgia's elite, and dripping with the kind of wealth that makes people whisper behind their programs. I stood at the back of the packed church, watching as speakers praised his business acumen and charitable contributions. None of them mentioned how he'd acquired half his land holdings, or the families displaced by his, quote, urban development projects. Marlene, my stepmother, sat in the front pew draped in designer black, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Beside her, my half-brother Lucas looked every inch the heir apparent in his $1,000 suit, already fielding condolences from potential business partners. My half-sister Anna sat quietly, the only one who acknowledged my presence with a brief, uncomfortable nod. After the service, we gathered in the mahogany-paneled study of the family mansion for the reading of the will. The lawyer, a silver-haired man named Patterson, cleared his throat as we took our seats around the massive oak table. I chose a chair near the door, already planning my exit. "To my wife Marlene," Patterson read, "I leave the estate and primary residence." Marlene squeezed her handkerchief, maintaining her composed facade. "To my son Lucas, I leave controlling interest in Reyes Construction, along with all business assets and properties." Lucas straightened, trying to look solemn while barely containing his satisfaction. "To my daughter Anna, I leave a trust fund of $2 million in the vacation home in Savannah." Anna nodded quietly, unsurprised. Then came the part I'd been dreading. "To my eldest son, Elliot." Patterson's voice grew careful, measured. "You chose to abandon your family's legacy for what you called a higher purpose. You have consistently shown poor judgment and a disappointing lack of ambition. While I cannot disinherit you entirely, I leave you only this. You are hereby named Executor of Trust D42, a minor land holding outside Macon. Perhaps managing this small responsibility will teach you something about real-world consequences." The room fell silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to hold its breath. Lucas smirked, while Marlene's lips curved into the faintest smile. Anna stared at her hands. I felt the familiar sting of my father's disapproval, even from beyond the grave. But something else nagged at me. Why name me executor of anything? Richard Reyes never did anything without calculation. "What exactly is Trust D42? I asked. Patterson shuffled his papers uncomfortably. "A small parcel of land, nothing significant." Nothing significant. Yet here I was, holding the keys to something my father deemed worth mentioning in his final act of judgment. I folded the trust documents and slipped them into my jacket pocket, feeling their weight like a stone. 3 days after the funeral, I sat across from Cyrus Patel in a cramped coffee shop near the Fulton County Courthouse. Steam rose from our cups as I spread the trust documents across the scarred wooden table. Cyrus had been my roommate at law school, and now he was one of Atlanta's most respected civil rights attorneys. More importantly, he was the only person who understood why I'd chosen public defense over private practice. "So your old man managed to insult you one last time," Cyrus said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he scanned the papers. "Trust D42? Sounds like something out of a spy novel." "That's what bothers me," I replied, sipping my coffee. "Dad never did anything without 3 ulterior motives. Why make me executor of some worthless land?" Cyrus flipped through the legal documents, his dark eyes narrowing as lawyers' eyes do when they smell something fishy. "This isn't just any land, Elliot. Look at this." He pointed to a paragraph buried in dense legal language. "This parcel is outside Macon, Georgia. 47 acres acquired in 1993. So I remember reading about land disputes in that area back in the 90s. There were allegations of forced sales, families pressured to sell family farms for development that never happened." He pulled out his phone and started typing. "And look at this clause here. It's buried on page 12. I leaned forward as Cyrus traced his finger along a section of text I'd skipped over. "The executor is hereby granted full authority to investigate the legal validity of the original acquisition and to act in the public interest should any irregularities be discovered." The words hit me like cold water. What does that mean exactly? "It means," Cyrus said slowly, setting down his phone, "that your father just handed you the keys to investigate his own business dealings. And if you find something illegal, you have the power to act on it." I stared at the document, my mind racing. That makes no sense. Why would he give me ammunition against his own company? Maybe he didn't think you'd be smart enough to use it. Cyrus's voice carried an edge of indignation that I recognized from our law school debates. Or maybe he figured you'd be too much of a failure to dig deep enough to find anything. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. I loosened my tie and tried to process what this meant. "You think there's actually something to find?" "Only one way to know for sure." Cyrus pulled up a map on his phone, zooming in on a rural area southeast of Macon. "The land is currently listed as undeveloped, but guess what? It's been used as collateral for several major loans taken out by Reyes Construction over the past 5 years. Loans totaling over $30 million. $30 million for empty land? That's the thing. It's not empty anymore. Satellite images show it's been quietly developed into a private industrial complex. No permits on file. No environmental impact studies. Nothing. I felt something I hadn't experienced since the will reading, a spark of genuine interest. So Dad left me as executor of land that's worth tens of millions, not knowing I'd have the legal authority to expose how he got it. "Looks that way." Cyrus grinned, the same expression he'd worn when we'd won our first moot court competition. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I thought about Lucas's smug face, Marlene's condescending smile, and my father's final judgment echoing in that mahogany-paneled room. For years, I'd chosen the high road, walking away from family fights, accepting their dismissal of my career, my values, my life. "I'm going to Macon," I said, folding the documents carefully. "And I'm going to find out exactly what Dad was so afraid I might discover." Cyrus raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Now that," he said, "sounds like the Elliot Reyes I went to law school with." For the first time since the funeral, I smiled. The drive to Macon took me through Georgia's rural heartland, where kudzu-covered trees lined highways that seemed frozen in time. I'd called ahead to the county clerk's office, but the records I needed were temporarily unavailable. Nothing suspicious about that. Instead, I found myself at Dolly's Diner on the outskirts of town, where the coffee was strong and the locals were willing to talk. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands, refilled my cup when I mentioned I was asking about the old Henderson property. "You mean the land that construction fella took?" She glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned closer. "Honey, that story's got more thorns than a briar patch." "I'm Richard Reyes's son," I said quietly. "I'm trying to understand what really happened." Her expression shifted from curiosity to pity. Lord have mercy. "You're here to clean up his mess, ain't you?" Before I could answer, she scribbled an address on a napkin. "Talk to Harold Blake. He used to work for your daddy, back before things went sideways. Lives out on Millfield Road now. Keeps to himself, mostly." Harold Blake's trailer sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by rusted car parts and overgrown weeds. The man who answered my knock looked like he'd aged 20 years in the past decade. His weathered face carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. "You look just like him," Harold said, not bothering to hide his distaste. "Same eyes, same stubborn jaw. But you ain't dressed like money, so maybe you ain't cut from the same cloth." "I'm here about the Henderson land," I said. "I want to know the truth." Harold studied me for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Truth's a luxury most folks can't afford. But come on in. Time somebody heard what really happened." His trailer was sparse but clean, with faded photographs of a younger Harold standing beside construction equipment. He poured 2 glasses of sweet tea and sat across from me at a small folding table. "I worked for Reyes Construction for 15 years, he began, his voice rough with old anger. "Good job, decent pay. Then your daddy set his sights on the Henderson place. What made that land so special? Railroad access. Perfect spot for a distribution center, if you could get the zoning changed." Harold's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his glass. "Problem was, the Hendersons didn't want to sell. Been farming that land for 3 generations. "So what happened?" Harold's laugh was bitter. "Your daddy happened. Started with lawsuits, property line disputes, environmental violations that didn't exist. When that didn't work, the county suddenly found code violations on their farmhouse. Amazing how fast bureaucracy moves when the right palms get greased." I felt sick. "And you saw all this?" Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Saw it, documented it, told your daddy it was wrong. Harold met my eyes. That's when I learned the difference between working for Richard Reyes and crossing him." "He fired you?" "Worse. He made sure I couldn't get work anywhere in the county. Blacklisted me." Harold stood and walked to a small closet, pulling out a cardboard box. "But I kept records. Every memo, every meeting note, every dirty trick. Been carrying this guilt for 30 years. He set the box on the table between us. Your daddy's dead now, but his sins ain't buried with him. Question is, what you gonna do about it?" Back in Atlanta, I sat in my cramped office until midnight, surrounded by Harold's documents and case law printouts. The evidence was damning. Forged environmental reports, bribes disguised as consulting fees, intimidation tactics that would make a mobster proud. My father hadn't just bent the rules, he'd shattered them. At 8 the next morning, I walked into the Fulton County Probate Court with a motion that would change everything. The clerk's eyes widened as she read the header. "Motion to activate investigative powers under Trust D42. "You sure about this, Mr. Reyes?" she asked quietly. "Your family's got a lot of influence in this building." "I'm sure," I replied, though my hands were trembling. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with angry calls I didn't answer. Lucas left 3 voicemails, each more furious than the last. Marlene's attorney called twice, offering to discuss this misunderstanding privately. I ignored them all. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday before Judge Monica Alvarez, a woman known for her fairness and her complete immunity to wealth and influence. She'd been on the bench for 20 years, and rumor had it she'd once held a billionaire in contempt for showing up late to court. When Thursday arrived, the courtroom was more crowded than I'd expected. Marlene sat in the front row wearing pearls and an expression of wounded dignity. Lucas flanked her in an expensive suit, whispering urgently to a team of lawyers who probably charged more per hour than I made in a month. Judge Alvarez entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen every legal trick in the book. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and her dark eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the packed courtroom. "Mr. Reyes," she said, addressing me directly, "you filed a motion to activate investigative powers under a trust provision. This is highly unusual." "Yes, Your Honor. The trust documents explicitly grant the executor authority to investigate the legal validity of the original land acquisition." Lucas's lead attorney, a silver-haired shark named Morrison, stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt by a disinherited son to contest his father's will through frivolous allegations." Judge Alvarez's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Morrison, Are you suggesting the trust provision is invalid? Not invalid, Your Honor, but... Then sit down. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to obedience. Mr. Elliot Reyes, what exactly are you alleging? I stood, feeling the weight of 3 decades of family disappointment and my own moral convictions colliding in this moment. Your Honor, I have evidence suggesting that the land in Trust D42 was acquired through fraud, intimidation, and bribery. The trust provision gives me both the authority and the obligation to investigate these allegations. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Marlene's face had gone pale, while Lucas looked like he wanted to leap across the gallery and throttle me. Judge Alvarez's gavel silenced the room. Mr. Reyes, these are serious allegations. Do you have documentation to support your claims? I do, Your Honor. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. This court grants your motion for preliminary investigation. You have 30 days to present your findings. Quote, as I walked out of the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the weight of purpose. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran the story on page 3. A state battle uncovers allegations against construction magnate. The byline belonged to Olivia Grant, a young investigative reporter who'd somehow gotten wind of the court hearing. Her article was careful, factual, and devastating. My phone started ringing at 6 in the morning. By noon, I'd received calls from 3 other newspapers, 2 television stations, and a documentary filmmaker. I also received a text from a number I didn't recognize. Drop this, or you'll regret it. Cyrus found me in my office that afternoon, poring over Harold's documents while fielding calls from reporters. You've kicked over a hornet's nest, he said, tossing a copy of the newspaper on my desk. Lucas held a press conference an hour ago. I looked up from a particularly damning memo about county inspector payoffs. What did he say? That you're a bitter, failed lawyer trying to destroy your family's reputation for money you were never entitled to. He's hired Morrison, Klein & Associates to handle defamation proceedings against you. Let him try. I held up a document. This is a receipt for a $20,000 payment to County Commissioner Bradley in 1993, disguised as a consulting fee. 3 days later, the Henderson property was mysteriously rezoned for industrial use. Cyrus whistled low. Bradley still on the commission. This could bring down half the county government. That's when Olivia Grant knocked on my office door. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 20s, with sharp eyes and a digital recorder already running. Mr. Reyes, I'm Olivia Grant from the Journal-Constitution. Do you have a few minutes? I gestured to the chair across from my desk. Depends on what you want to know. I want to know why you're willing to destroy your family's legacy. The question caught me off guard with its directness. I sat back, considering my words carefully. What legacy? The money? The buildings? Those aren't legacy. They're just monuments to greed. Your stepmother says you're motivated by spite. My stepmother would say that. I leaned forward, meeting Olivia's gaze. But spite doesn't make you spend your own money on court filings and document analysis. Spite doesn't make you drive to Macon to interview people who lost their homes 30 years ago. Then what does? Quote, I thought about Harold Blake sitting in his trailer, carrying 30 years of guilt, about the Henderson family forced off land their grandfather had farmed, about every defendant I'd represented who couldn't afford justice. Conscience, I said simply. Olivia's article ran the next day with the headline, The Conscience of a Reyes. It included interviews with 3 Macon residents who remembered the Henderson land grab, a former county employee who recalled suspicious meetings, and a detailed timeline of the property acquisition. By evening, my email inbox contained 47 messages from people across Georgia sharing similar stories about Reyes construction projects. Lucas called me directly for the first time in 8 years. You're tearing apart everything Dad built. His voice was tight with rage. Dad built his empire on other people suffering, I replied. Maybe it's time it came down. The line went dead, but I knew this was just the beginning. In 36 hours, I was due back in Judge Alvarez's courtroom with my preliminary findings, and Lucas wasn't going to make it easy. The courtroom was packed when Harold Blake took the witness stand. His weathered hands shook slightly as he placed them on the Bible, but his voice was steady when Judge Alvarez asked him to state his name for the record. Harold Eugene Blake. I worked for Reyes Construction from 1978 to 1993. Cyrus handled the direct examination with surgical precision, walking Harold through his employment history, his role as project supervisor, and his growing concerns about company practices. When they reached the Henderson property acquisition, Harold's testimony became devastating. Mr. Reyes called me into his office in March of 1993, Harold said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. He told me the Henderson farm was essential for company expansion. When I asked about the family that lived there, he said, "That's not our problem, Harold. Our problem is making them understand it's in their best interest to sell." "What did you understand that to mean?" Cyrus asked. Harold's eyes found mine across the courtroom. I understood it to mean we weren't going to take no for an answer. Morrison's cross-examination was brutal but ineffective. Harold had documentation for everything: memos, receipts, photographs of intimidation tactics. When Morrison suggested Harold was lying for money, Harold's response silenced the courtroom. "Son, I'm 73 years old, living on Social Security in a trailer I can barely afford to heat. What money do you think I'm getting out of this?" The documents spoke for themselves. Shell companies created to hide bribes, environmental reports altered after submission, a recorded phone conversation between my father and County Commissioner Bradley discussing mutually beneficial arrangements. During a recess, Marlene approached me in the hallway. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked vulnerable, almost desperate. "Elliot, this has gone far enough," she said quietly. "The company stock has dropped 30% since this started. People are losing their jobs." "People lost their homes 30 years ago," I replied. "Where was your concern then?" "I'll make you an offer," she continued as if I hadn't spoken. $5 million. Cash. You drop this investigation, and we'll quietly establish a charitable foundation in your mother's name." The offer hung in the air between us. $5 million would change my life completely. I could quit public defense, maybe start my own practice, help more people than I ever could working for the state. "You think this is about money?" I asked. "Everything's about money, Elliot. Your father knew that. Lucas knows it. Even you know it deep down." I looked at her carefully applied makeup, her designer clothes, her manicured fingers clutching a Hermes purse. "You're wrong," I said. "Some things can't be bought." Judge Alvarez's ruling came 2 hours later. The evidence was overwhelming. Trust D42 would be dissolved, with all assets redirected to a reparations fund for affected families. Furthermore, the court was recommending a state investigation into Reyes Construction's business practices dating back to 1990. As the gavel fell, I saw Lucas's face crumble. Marlene sat frozen, staring straight ahead. Anna was crying quietly in the back row. But Harold Blake was smiling for the first time in 30 years. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within a week of Judge Alvarez's ruling, Reyes Construction's stock price had plummeted 40%. 3 major investors pulled out of pending projects, citing reputational concerns. The Georgia State Ethics Board announced a formal investigation into county corruption dating back 3 decades. I learned about the death threats from Cyrus, who'd been monitoring my mail after someone left a dead rat on my apartment doorstep. "You need to take this seriously," he said, spreading police reports across my kitchen table. "Anonymous calls to your office, your car getting keyed, now this." The latest was a photo of me leaving the courthouse, with my face circled in red marker and a single word scrawled across it: traitor. "Maybe I should have taken Marlene's money," I said, staring at the image. "Don't you dare," Cyrus snapped. "You did the right thing. The hard thing, but the right thing." That evening, as I sat in my apartment with the blinds drawn, my phone rang. Anna's name appeared on the screen, the first time she'd called me in years. "Elliot?" Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Anna, what's wrong?" "I'm at Lucas's house. He's not handling this well. He's been drinking since the ruling, and tonight he's talking about hiring people to fix the problem." My blood ran cold. "What kind of people?" I don't know, but I'm scared. He keeps saying you've destroyed everything, that Dad would never forgive him for letting this happen. She paused, and I could hear her crying. Elliot, I think you should stay somewhere else for a while. Anna, listen to me. You need to get out of there. Come to my apartment, or go to a hotel, but don't stay. I can't. Marlene's here too, and they're planning something. Some kind of press conference where they're going to... God, Elliot, they have pictures. What pictures? From when you were arrested in college. The DUI charge that got dropped. They're going to say you're an alcoholic, that you can't be trusted, that this whole investigation is just you acting out because of your drinking problem. I remembered that night from 15 years ago. A stupid mistake after a law school party. Charges that were dismissed when the breathalyzer proved faulty. But in the court of public opinion, facts mattered less than narrative. They're also saying you've been taking money from the families you're supposedly helping, Anna continued. Lucas hired a private investigator to go through your finances. They won't find anything because there's nothing to find. I know that. But Elliot, they don't care about the truth anymore. They just want to destroy you. After Anna hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, listening to the city noise filtering through my windows. I thought about Harold Blake, who'd carried his guilt for 30 years, about the Henderson family, whose story would finally be told, about all the families who'd been steamrolled by my father's ambition. Then I thought about the price of truth, not just the money I'd turned down, but the safety I was losing, the family bridges I was burning, the simple life I'd built that was now under siege. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Last warning. I turned off the lights and went to bed, knowing tomorrow would bring fresh attacks. But for the first time in weeks, my conscience was quiet. The final hearing drew crowds that spilled out of the courthouse and onto the front steps. News vans lined Pryor Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward a gray October sky. I counted at least 30 people from Macon in the gallery, including elderly Mrs. Henderson, whose family had lost their farm 40 years ago. Lucas's character assassination campaign had made headlines for 3 days running. The Atlanta Constitution ran his accusations above the fold. Brother claims a state challenger has history of substance abuse. But Olivia Grant's follow-up investigation had been thorough and damning. She'd found the dismissed charges, the faulty breathalyzer, and the arresting officer who'd since been fired for evidence tampering. Still, I could feel the weight of public scrutiny as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table. Morrison and his legal team occupied the entire defense side, armed with briefcases and the confidence that only unlimited billable hours can provide. Judge Alvarez entered with her usual efficiency, but I noticed something different in her demeanor, a quiet intensity that suggested she understood the magnitude of this moment. This court will now hear final arguments regarding the dissolution of Trust D42 and the allocation of reparations, she announced. Cyrus stood to present our case. For 45 minutes, he methodically laid out the evidence, the forged documents, the bribes, the intimidation tactics, the families displaced. He called Mrs. Henderson to testify, and her voice trembled as she described watching bulldozers tear down the farmhouse where she'd been born. Your Honor, she said, her weathered hands gripping the witness stand, we never wanted to fight. We just wanted to keep our home. Morrison's response was predictable. He attacked my motives, questioned the credibility of witnesses who were clearly coached, and argued that dissolving the trust would set a dangerous precedent for a state law. But then Lucas made a critical error. Against his lawyer's advice, he demanded to take the stand. My brother has always resented this family's success, he said, his voice carrying the arrogance I remembered from childhood. He chose poverty over prosperity, and now he wants to drag us all down with him. Judge Alvarez leaned forward. Mr. Lucas Reyes, are you suggesting the documented evidence of fraud is fabricated? I'm saying my brother would do anything to hurt this family. Including manufacturing receipts for bribes, forging your father's signature on shell company documents? Lucas faltered. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? The courtroom was dead silent as Lucas struggled to answer. Finally, Judge Alvarez dismissed him from the stand. Her ruling was swift and comprehensive. The trust would be dissolved immediately, with all assets, now valued at $47 million, directed to a community development fund for affected families. Furthermore, she was recommending criminal charges against several county officials and a federal investigation into Reyes Construction's business practices. This court finds that Richard Reyes engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud, bribery, and intimidation spanning multiple decades, Judge Alvarez declared. The executor of Trust D42 has not only fulfilled his legal obligations but has served the cause of justice. As the gavel fell, I felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph but relief. The weight I'd carried since childhood, the burden of being the family disappointment, finally lifted from my shoulders. Behind me, Mrs. Henderson was crying tears of joy. 6 months later, I stood in the spring sunshine outside the new Henderson Community Center, watching children play on equipment that had been built where Richard Reyes once planned a distribution warehouse. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father's ill-gotten gains had been transformed into something that actually served the community he'd tried to exploit. Harold Blake stood beside me, looking healthier than I'd seen him since our first meeting. The settlement had allowed him to buy a small house in town, and more importantly, it had given him something he'd lost 30 years ago: peace. "Your daddy would be spinning in his grave," Harold said, but there was no malice in his voice anymore. "Good," I replied, and we both laughed. Olivia Grant approached us with her camera crew in tow. Her series on the Reyes case had won a Polk Award for investigative journalism, and she was filming a follow-up piece on the community development projects. "How does it feel to see the land being used this way?" she asked, pointing her microphone toward me. I watched a group of teenagers shooting basketball on the new court, their laughter echoing across the property that had once been the source of so much pain. "It feels like redemption," I said simply. After the filming wrapped, I drove back to Atlanta with an unexpected passenger. Anna had called that morning, asking if she could ride with me to the ceremony. It was the first time we'd been alone together in over a decade. "I owe you an apology," she said as we crossed the county line. "I should have stood up for you years ago." "You were protecting your family, I understand that." "No, I was protecting myself." She stared out the window at the passing farmland. It was easier to stay quiet than to face the truth about who Dad really was. We drove in comfortable silence for a while before she spoke again. "Lucas is in therapy now. The whole thing broke something in him. Marlene's moved to Florida. Says she can't stand the shame." "And you?" "I'm figuring it out. I quit the family business, obviously. Started working for a non-profit that helps families displaced by development projects." She smiled wryly. "Turns out there are a lot of them." Back in my apartment that evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a letter from the mayor of Atlanta, offering me a position as the city's new ethics advisor. The salary was triple what I made as a public defender. I set the letter aside and opened another piece of mail. A handwritten thank you note from Mrs. Henderson. "Dear Mr. Reyes," it read in shaky handwriting, "you gave us back our dignity. That's worth more than all the money in the world." I thought about Cyrus, who'd been encouraging me to run for local office. "You've got name recognition now," he'd argued. "You could actually change things on a bigger scale." Maybe he was right. Maybe this was just the beginning of something larger. But for now, I was content to return to my modest office tomorrow morning, to represent people who couldn't afford justice, to continue the work I'd chosen over my father's empire. I'd finally proven that success couldn't be measured in dollars, and disappointment wasn't destiny. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed in Marlene's familiar, precise handwriting. I almost threw it away unopened, but something made me pause. After everything that had happened, what could she possibly have left to say? I sat at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold as I read her words. "Elliot, I won't pretend this is an apology. We both know I'm not capable of that kind of grace. But I need you to understand something your father never told you. Richard was afraid of you, not because you challenged him, but because you reminded him of what he could never be. When he looked at you, he saw the man he might have become if he'd had your courage to choose principles over profit. He wrote that clause into the trust because deep down he knew someone needed to clean up his mess. He just never thought you'd be brave enough to do it. You were never the failure, Elliot. We were. The letter wasn't signed. That afternoon, I drove to Westview Cemetery for the first time since the funeral. My mother's grave was in the older section, marked by a simple granite stone that read, Elliot Reyes, beloved mother. I'd bought fresh flowers, yellow roses, her favorite, and knelt to place them by the headstone. From my jacket pocket, I pulled out the original will, the document that had called me a disappointment, a failure, a man who had chosen poorly. The pages fluttered in the autumn breeze as I held them over the small trash can beside the maintenance shed. I finally figured it out, Mom, I said quietly. Success isn't about what you inherit, it's about what you choose to do when no one's watching. I struck a match and watched the will burn, the harsh words dissolving into ash and smoke. When the last piece crumbled away, I felt something I'd been carrying for 34 years finally release its grip on my heart. Walking back to my car, I thought about the phone call I'd received that morning from Judge Alvarez. The state had offered me a position heading a new task force on corporate accountability. The work would be demanding, the opposition fierce, but it would allow me to expand the fight I'd started with Trust D42. I thought about Harold Blake, finally at peace in his new home, about Mrs. Henderson, whose family farm was now a thriving community center, about Anna, who'd found her own path toward redemption, even about Lucas, slowly rebuilding his life one therapy session at a time. My phone buzzed with a text from Cyrus. Coffee tomorrow? I've got another case you might find interesting. I smiled as I typed back, absolutely. As I drove away from the cemetery, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in my life, I looked like a man who belonged exactly where he was. Not because I'd inherited a legacy, but because I'd created one. The Reyes name would always carry the stain of what my father had done, but maybe, just maybe, it could also carry the hope of what I had chosen to become. That was a legacy worth leaving. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.